Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. These days, it's rarely a case of if you'll be hacked and more of a question of when. Once the attacker has passed your defenses, they cover their tracks and systematically infiltrate your network to steal information or shut your business down. You need to rethink the way security is delivered for your digitally transformed business, and there's one security solution that delivers it all: NetScout. Get visibility without borders for consistent detection, mitigation, and prevention across any network, data center, cloud, 5G, and more. Learn more at securityweekly.com/NetScout. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. This year's Compass Cybersecurity Symposium is being held at Twin River Casino in Lincoln, Rhode Island on September 25th. It's next week, just 15 minutes outside of Providence, plenty of parking. The speakers include social engineering expert Chris Hadnagi and myself. Use the discount code SW2019 to save $20 on registration. I am really excited about my talk. I was working on it last night and this morning and refreshing it as it's kind of been evolving. So I'm excited. I got some new angles to talk about. So I don't want to spoil it.
Right, but you got to keep it fresh.
I got to keep it fresh because it'll be the same one that I'm giving in Atlanta. And I'm debating whether or not I want to give it next year as well. Maybe one time. I don't know. We'll see. So, Matt, we're talking about the cloud security stack.
We are. Now, it's been a few weeks back. I got tasked with putting together a cloud security matrix to help people understand, okay, when I move to cloud, what security products do I need to look at? And so I did my homework, and I did take the time. We actually did a webcast last week that helped pull some of the initial stuff together. And so Paul and I thought we would, create a segment and share it back with everybody and go through it. So let me share my screen here and get us up and running on the presentation. All right, so hopefully everybody can see that now.
Yes.
Oh, except for I hit escape. Of course I did.
I hate it when that happens.
I hate it when it happens. I went to hit the arrow button. Okay, so what security products do you need in the cloud? And like I said, we did some prep work last week for a webcast that was talking about some security products that were moving to the cloud. And so to start with, I just wanted to lay out some interesting cloud trends that I think will have a broader impact to security long term. One, we're seeing cloud providers starting to build their own security products. And we talked a lot about Amazon and AWS in the first segment because they have been pretty aggressive in actually building out a lot of security capabilities into their cloud platform. Paul, back in the day, it was, one of the first ones we saw was Inspector.
Yes, I remember that vividly, right? Because it competed in the vulnerability management space.
Exactly right. And everybody was like, oh, yeah, but it'll take Inspector a long time to, get full coverage. Mm-hmm. Inspector has a huge number of CVE capabilities that they can manage in that product. Then we saw things like CloudTrail and CloudWatch and X-Ray and Guard Duty. The list goes on and on and on. It is hard to keep up actually some days with how much stuff they're actually building and making available to their customers as security capabilities in their cloud platform. So this has an impact because now you have some choices. Do I use the cloud provider service or do I use a third-party service? And I don't know that we'll answer that for you in this segment, but we'll talk about it. Multi-cloud strategies are growing, and sometimes at the expense of hybrid solutions. So that adds in this interesting dynamic. If you're on-prem and single cloud provider, for example, you've got to hybridize your solutions, security solutions across those. When you add in multi-cloud, it adds some variation, I think, a little bit. And I think you have to make better informed decisions around security tools that are portable. Portability becomes a big component now because if I'm running containers in AWS or in Azure or Google Cloud, depending on how you're running those containers, could influence the different security tools that you leverage so that you get the same level of security across those different environments. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And this last trend, everyone's going serverless, which means the true abstraction of the underlying infrastructure is here to stay. I've been talking about this for years. We're abstracting away the network. We're abstracting away the endpoint. And as we continue to move down this path, the ability to apply security at those layers are going to go away. Mm-hmm. All right. So who's responsible for security in the cloud? This is the slide, slight modification, Paul, from last week's webcast. In understanding who's responsible for security in the cloud, on the far left, let's assume I'm running on-premise. I, the customer, I manage it all, right? I'm responsible for security every single layer. I have to worry about security at the network, storage, compute, all the way up through the user level. But as I go to the cloud, the responsibility matrix shifts depending on the type of cloud service you're actually adopting. Now, the traditional cloud migration strategies that we've seen over the past 3 to 5 years has been moving dedicated servers from on-premise into infrastructure as a service, right? I'm spinning up dedicated EC2 instances in Amazon to run certain services that I had in my data center. And when we think about infrastructure as a service, aspects of the network, storage, compute, and virtualization layers are managed by Amazon, and where you take over is at the operating system level and above. So that means your basic host kind of stuff is still applicable in this particular model. Mm-hmm. But what we've started to see over the past couple years, and this is where I think the acceleration is going to go for a lot of organizations, is that they're moving away from dedicated infrastructure into platform as a service. Let me give you some examples because I think they're relevant. If I'm running my own dedicated EC2 instances with Kubernetes running on top, what some customers have realized is that's a lot of work. Mm-hmm. I have to figure out the bin packing issue. How many containers can I run on a host? And then auto scale all that infrastructure. And so we've seen this move away from dedicated Kubernetes clusters on EC2, moving to something like ECS or EKS in Amazon or a GKE in Google, where the orchestration layer is really managed by the cloud provider. It abstracts away, again, a portion of this that makes it easier to auto scale and grow because the cloud provider is now responsible for that auto scaling, but they're also responsible for aspects of securing the operating system and the orchestrator itself, whether it's in ECS, it's Amazon's specific proprietary orchestrator, or EKS, it's Kubernetes. And so you see that abstraction layer there. And that creates some differences in what you need to manage. Then we'll see this continued abstraction, and we're starting to see more people go after what I call function as a service, Lambda type of things. And Paul, you and I have talked about how Lambda and how it fits into our application, for example, right? Because we're actually kind of IaaS today.
Well, so what I had kind of had this, could be an aha moment. I'll let you be the judge and our listeners, right? If I look at applications today, even ours is an example, it's not an all or nothing. So I don't think your entire application is going to live in any one of these columns. Conceivably, you're going to have pieces of your application spread throughout all of these columns. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it difficult, right? Which pieces go where, and then what security do I need to put around them and inside my application? And if I'm not losing, if like the further right I go in the chart, the more control I give up, right? But that could be just for pieces of my application. So it's really a quite a complex matrix to understand how to deploy your application and then understand which security components I need based on the risk of even those individual components, not just the application itself, right? You might, in our example, we've got some on-premise stuff because that's where we record everything. I can't put that in the cloud. Heck, a lot of it is really difficult to even virtualize, right? Then you may have other hosted infrastructure doing other components, and then moving right along. We've talked about some functions being really great for Lambda, right? And some other things living in Fargate. And so, the more dynamic and complex and large your application gets, the more you might be checking boxes in all of these different columns just for one application. Mind you, enterprises today could have hundreds, if not thousands, of applications.
Right. And so it creates this really complex matrix. But in our example, we run containers on an operating system on dedicated EC2 instances. We're looking at potentially using functions for our publishing services because they don't need to be live all the time.
Right.
We publish when a show is ready to publish. It goes out, it posts to YouTube and Libsyn and our website, and we don't need that function running anymore, so we can spin it down, right? So we already have an IaaS kind of FaaS relationship. If I go one step further, think about HubSpot for us. That's a software as a service.
Yep.
We don't own the security of the application. We own certain configuration components of the app, which is why I turn this one into like a shared responsibility at the application layer.
Yep.
Because aspects are done by the SaaS provider, but some of that requires us to configure and maintain as well. So we do own a little bit of security in HubSpot.
And a great example too, like HubSpot lets you send data to a webhook, right?
Yep.
And you have some control over the security around that, right? And HubSpot does as well. I don't think they let you send a webhook to a non-SSL service, right? So there's inherently some security built in, but you choose how it's going to authenticate to your web service that's running somewhere, right? Is there some kind of passcode or passphrase, right? Now HubSpot's responsible for securing those credentials, but you can configure those or not inside the interface. So I like the shared responsibility. I think the diagonal through that, Matt, is perfect.
Yeah, and then at the user layer, we own the user layer across the board. We're the ones who provide user access. Data is the other layer in here. I couldn't find a good place to put it and keep this matrix clean, but just for everybody listening, you still own data security. Now, you might get some capabilities out of the cloud provider at the different storage levels, but there's some additional things on the data side that are still going to be interesting in the cloud environments as well, even with your SaaS providers.
Well, and we talked about insider threat this week. We talked about in the last segment about securing and encrypting your data. Yep. In the HubSpot example, I can totally go in and export data. Now it's wherever the user decides to put it, right? So that's still your responsibility.
Yeah, you're going to see that in Salesforce and the other CRM tools. I mean, and these are all SaaS platforms, right? So data is another big piece here. So this is kind of the responsibility matrix. We've had conversations on this in the past, but I wanted to kind of put our little variation on this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through. I'm going to start on the right-hand side. I'm going to start at SaaS, and I'm going to kind of walk us back. Because these layers continue, they're additive. What you do in SaaS also has to be done in function as a service. And what's done in SaaS and function as a service has to be done in platform. So I'm going to do an additive to kind of walk you through the different layers that are still a requirement from a security product perspective across these. I thought it was the easier way to do it instead of trying to create these super busy slides to try to streamline it a bit. So what security products do you need in software as a service? All the identity products you still need, right? You need identity and access platforms, whether that's a Ping or a SailPoint or an Okta or a combination of those platforms, because you have to manage authentication into these systems, password management, multi-factor authentication, and maybe even privileged access vaults, right? The CyberArks and
I would also say
Trust.
In our HubSpot example, Matt, that API security is something that you need to worry about as well. When you have any type of SaaS solution, typically they will offer an API, and one of the ways most businesses, ourselves included, interact with that is for some business process automation and business operations, right?
Agreed.
Analytics as well. I mean, so you're likely the option is there to use the API from the SaaS provider, and then there's services that like Zapier, right, integrates all the APIs together, and a lot of that responsibility for security still falls on you. I mean, they are responsible for providing security capabilities in their API. But a lot of that, we were talking earlier about, it comes down to how you configure it, right?
Exactly right. And I do hit that on the next slide, by the way. I just didn't put it on this slide. Because it's a shared responsibility, it should actually be here. But I addressed a lot of the application API stuff in the next slide. Mm-hmm. But I wanted everybody to know, look, identity in the whole user security component, you have to own that end-to-end in the cloud. You just have to. Where are you going to put your different keys to provide access to service accounts? All these things that we talk about on a regular basis are things you're going to have to manage regardless of which kind of cloud environment you're in. Mm-hmm. So let's get into this next one, right? And so this, Paul, to your point, this is where I get into more of the application-specific components. Vulnerability management still exists at the application layer. And you're going to see this term used over and over and over again, because one of the things that's been interesting in a lot of my interactions with some of the investors and the financial analysts is how people define vulnerability management. The old traditional vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management space really was about device and network vulnerabilities. And over time, vulnerabilities have morphed into the application, into different layers. But I split those out separately when I talk about things like vulnerability management vendors, because as we were debating in the last segment, who's doing vulnerability management at the different layers, because it will impact who you look at to manage vulnerabilities across a very diverse stack, whether it's cloud or on-prem. And so when I think about vulnerability management at the application layer, I'm thinking about static code analysis, the Vericodes, and Fortifies, right? They're doing the static code analysis, looking for vulnerabilities in your code. You have a lot of the dynamic application testing solutions that are out there. The stuff we did with Arachne, what Rapid7 has with AppSpider, Qualys's web app scanning, and others. NetSparker is a dynamic application testing company that's a sponsor of ours. So you have, and they're all looking for different types of vulnerabilities, either statically or dynamically. All relevant. I also have some runtime protection capabilities at the application layer. So we have things like runtime application self-protection and the web app firewalls, the stuff that Signal Sciences is doing, and other types of these vendors in the market, where runtime application self-protection as a standalone product really never got much traction. But when we see that paired with a web application firewall, kind of what Signal Sciences is doing, you get this really interesting balance of understanding what the application's doing and then making adjustments to your web app firewall settings to actually protect the app. And we did a webcast on this with them a few weeks back.
Yep.
Yeah. You can also get some runtime protections on the container security side. Now, container security vendors have both static and runtime capabilities. I worked at Layered Insight, which Qualys acquired, which really focused on runtime security and protecting the security at the runtime, and then built some static capabilities. You had other vendors like Aqua, Twistlock, StackRox building static capabilities, and now they're moving into the runtime security side. So again, there's different levels of maturity in the container security space. And then API security here is a big component on the runtime application, just because these applications are interacting with so many different APIs, publicly facing, privately, internal, between microservices. The complexity here is big, and there's a whole evolving set of capabilities at the API security layer.
Yeah, I also think, once you, even just owning the application and even the container, you need something inside your container or your application or in front of your application that's giving you security, telemetry, and some protection. I really like Signal Sciences. They've been a sponsor for a long time. I really like Capsulate. And we've spoken with a lot of vendors in these spaces. And, moving forward, Matt, I think my recommendation is you need something like that. It gives you the security and visibility independent of cloud provider, potentially in a lot of cases, also independent of the services that you're using in any given cloud provider. And I think that's just going to be the norm. You're going to have something embedded in your app and or container that gives you security visibility and protection and detection.
Yep, agreed. Let's keep going down the stack. So now I'm running platform as a service. Where do I need to put security? Now at the function level, you can wrap your functions in a container, and then you can add some runtime container capabilities in there to protect around the functions. And then APIs here, again, I think are a very important part of functions because you're spinning up these functions through Lambdas as an API call, letting it do its thing, returning status code, spinning itself down. So container and or API security at this function layer are still really relevant. Now at the container, I still have vulnerability and configuration issues I have to manage here. And this can be done in various ways. So we see a lot of vulnerability coming out of the software composition analysis tools, the white sources, the black ducks, where they're looking at the different libraries and binaries embedded into your container environment and the different open source components and looking for vulnerabilities, maybe even allowing you to apply some configuration rules around versions or license type, et cetera. The container security vendors are doing this as well. These static analysis guys that I talked about, the early Twistlocks, the Aqua Securities, the StackRocks, they're building vulnerability and configuration checks into the container image itself, and even the cloud workload protection. So this is where I get into Capsulate a little bit, Paul, right? And this is Capsulate and LSeed and Cloud Passage, where they're protecting the container, but they're also protecting aspects of the workload components under the container. So as we go down, you're going to see the cloud workload protection vendors at this level and down a couple levels because they're protecting the workloads that are part of containers, which includes the orchestrators. So yeah, they have some container capabilities here. The only challenge I have with the CWPPs in general is that at some layer, they potentially get abstracted away. And that's because they're not running on dedicated instances or dedicated orchestration components anymore. And then where do they have to put some of their capabilities? Well, they'll have to embed them into the application or into the container. And that's where I see some of the container security companies maybe having a little better advantage over the traditional cloud workload protection vendors. And then APIs come back in here again, because again, a lot of these containers and microservices are communicating to each other through these, they could be private APIs. And there's a lot of authentication requirements between the microservices and the containers that need to happen, need to be managed, keys need to be managed. It's a huge issue when you think about these really diverse applications. All right, ready for the next layer?
I am.
All right. So now we go down to next layer. So now I'm in infrastructure as a service. I'm going to start at the bottom. All your operating system type requirements come into play. I need to do my own vulnerability management, the traditional Tenable Rapid7 Qualys. I need to do patch management because now I've got to patch these systems because I own the operating system, so I need to patch them, which means your Automoxes and other patching solutions of the world, Kaseya's, et cetera, are in this piece. I need to manage the configuration of the operating systems, what Qualys did with policy compliance and other configuration management pieces. I have endpoint protection potentially on these systems and my EDR solutions that are all running at this operating system level. So this is very close to probably on-prem at the endpoint layer when we think about those common layers at the endpoint that we need to manage around. They all still apply in an infrastructure as a service because you're really owning that operating system layer and up. And so all those tools come over in this kind of deployment. But what gets potentially added on top of that is if you're running your own orchestrator, Kubernetes, Swarm, whatever, now I also have to do vulnerability management at the orchestrator. I have to manage the configuration of that orchestrator. This is where the cloud workload protection vendors, I think, come in really well, is because they help manage all these different components and bring them together to manage these environments. We're seeing a lot of the traditional vulnerability management scanners, again, Qualys Tenable Rapid7, looking for vulnerabilities on the different types of orchestration layers. You're seeing CIS benchmarks now for Kubernetes and Docker Swarm, which help you manage the configuration of those environments. And so these layers definitely come in as well.
It's interesting. There's use cases for every piece in the stack, right?
There is. And what's interesting is, if you've noticed a common theme yet, vulnerability management and configuration happen at a lot of the layers here. But the types of vulnerabilities and configurations you look at vary. In where I see a big gap right now, Paul, is no one vendor does all the vulnerability and configuration detection holistically yet, which means I'm still probably bringing in a couple different solutions at different layers to figure out how to piece it all together. And I think that's a challenge for people. It
is. Yeah, it's like I've always said, you got to do the same stuff, but you just got to do it in different places, and it's very fragmented.
Right. So how do I integrate and bring all that stuff together? So let's talk about some of the cloud security challenges, right? One, we know that cloud, we have limited visibility and control. As we abstract more and more stuff away, there's fewer places for us to insert security in to give us that visibility and control at the highest layers, right? Which is why I've always talked about application, user, and data security is three of those areas where I actually can gain visibility and control in my environment, because I may not have access to any of the other layers depending on how I deploy. And so if I'm going to make investments where I can have visibility and control, I'm going to do it at the application layer, I'm going to do it at the user layer, and I'm going to do it at the data layer, wherever I can. Because I think those transcend regardless of how you run.
Yeah.
The other big challenge in this space is misconfiguration of multiple cloud services. The first segment we talked about is a perfect example. There are many examples out there. The challenge around configuration is everything is defined as a configuration file by different teams in the DevOps process, integrated together and deployed without understanding the interdependencies of all these different services. And one misconfiguration at one layer can create an attack vector 3, 4, 5 layers away. And I think this is a really big challenge, which is why you see this common theme of configuration management at these different layers, because this is where the attacks on the cloud is actually happening. It's not the cloud provider's issue per se. It is a misconfiguration of one of their services that are allowing these attacks in. And this is one of our big gaps in the security landscape.
Yeah, as evidenced recently just on our shows, right? We've highlighted some of those interesting kind of attack paths that utilize those misconfigurations. Some are, it's like a balance between what the cloud provider gives you for functionality and gives you control over, and what they might not, and how easy or difficult it is to apply configuration, how visible that missing configuration is. I think they're really one of the fundamental problems we have today. Is kind of like where we were with Active Directory a while ago, right? We don't even know about all of the different threats. I think MITRE ATT&CK made that, more visible for Active Directory, and I'm really seeing these cloud services be very similar. And developers think this is great. I'm pushing code forward. I'm using all these services. We're maybe doing it cheaper and faster and than we were before. But all of a sudden you uncover just one small misconfiguration and or vulnerability in some of those configurations, and the consequences can be disastrous. There was a software company that had a bug in their API gateway, and they had to contact every single customer and explain the vulnerability and the remediation, and they did a great job with it. But, that's the impact of some of these bugs.
Exactly. And where I think the next frontier for newer solutions, and again, I do a lot of advisory work for some of these early stage startups, validating the configuration and understanding the interdependency of these configurations before you spin up the environment is kind of the next frontier. Can I do it? Can I do it in a really seamless, frictionless way in the DevOps pipeline? But make our infrastructure more secure before it actually gets spun up. Because a lot of the solutions out there are looking at the configuration after it's already running. So you have a lot of solutions out there integrating into the cloud management consoles and pulling down the configuration and looking for misconfiguration. But by then it's almost too late because it's already running in a misconfigured state. What I think the next frontier will be is people doing that before it actually gets deployed and identifying those misconfigurations and gaps, and then continually monitoring those in the cloud to make sure that they're not drifting from those known states. I think that's kind of one of these next areas that there's a really interesting space to watch, because it's going to solve a lot of this number 2 issue. And then the last, I think, big challenge for cloud security is integrating all the different security solutions together across hybrid and multi-cloud deployments. If I'm using Inspector in AWS, but I'm using Tenable Qualys Rapid7 in my on-prem, and I'm using, something else in Microsoft or Google, how do I integrate all that data together? Remember, I talked about vulnerability management happening at different layers, but not all provided by one company today. I need a place to integrate all those vulnerabilities together. We've seen the threat and vulnerability management vendors, for example, do this with device vulnerability data. But who's going to continue to evolve this into the orchestration layer, the container layer, maybe the application layer? Who's going to be that integration point for all this vulnerability data across multiple sources to come together? Who's going to do that for configuration? Who's going to do that for any of the other types of solutions I need to integrate into the environment? I think that's, again, another potential opportunity for startups in the space to potentially look at how do you integrate all these data components together and provide value on that kind of centralized view of some of these different security capabilities that are needed. All right.
Outstanding.
That's my slide deck, baby.
It's great information, Matt. Something we are all struggling with, I think, if you're deploying applications, and something we'll continue to struggle with for some time until it all settles out. Or maybe it won't. Who knows?
It might not.
Certainly a lot of fun in the meantime. So, Matt, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this edition of Enterprise Security Weekly. We'll see you next time.